Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest edition of RE189, where I take old stories I've narrated and update them to modern audio standards. This particular story is part 1 in a 4-part series called A Human Nursemaid. Written by Chimpanzee Writes. On an alien world, working for an alien family, Florence felt out of her depth. Minister Yugni of Norak had been assassinated, and the capital was a bloodbath. Native Ghanaians had begun putting those damned Xenos out of their homes and places of work, killing them right there on the street. The news called it the start of a full-blown genocide, at least at first. The Ghanaians, who followed Minister Obernak, had managed to wrestle the control of the airways from the government 2 days later, after their leader's murder. Florence, blindsided by killing, had been too focused on taking care of Millie, the infant daughter of the Cognac ambassador, to pay attention to politics. She knew Minister Orbernak's xenophobic rhetoric had increased since she arrived, but she never realized it had gotten this bad. Keep her head down and get her job done, that's what her father had told her before she left, and she kept that in her heart. Florence did her best to be a good nursemaid to Millie. Despite being from a completely different planet, the infant girl loved her. She could feel it, and she loved Millie in return. All this stuff on the TV, this was bigger than her. This was a whole planet stuff. It was other people's jobs to deal with that stuff. She was just going to take care of Millie. That was her job. Carrying Millie out of the room, she continued rocking her to sleeping in her arms, trying to push the horrible images from her mind. The rest of the planetside family stayed glued to the TV, watching and waiting to see what was going to happen next. Unfortunately for all of them, the Cognac ambassador, Mr. Cattell, had returned to his home system for an urgent meeting regarding the collapsing relations between his people and the Ghanaians. He left the whole family behind. People were traveling off-planet at unprecedented levels over the past couple of weeks. Ambassador Cattell had wanted to take his family with him, including Florence, which made her feel incredibly grateful. But it was impossible to find enough seats for all of them. Gasps came from the other room, quickly followed by sobs and Sergeant Cattell running out of the room. Florence quietly tried to signal him without waking Millie, but the eldest Cattell's son kept running in his military uniform. Florence's indecision of what to do next was quickly resolved as the remaining family members rushed out into the hallway and headed up the stairs. "What happened?" Florence asked Mrs. Cattell. "Is everything all right?" "We're leaving, Florence," she said between rushed breaths. "I need you to get all of Millie's outing stuff, as much as you can fit into her day bag. Also, grab anything that you think you'll need. I'll get your credentials when I grab all of ours." Florence tried to ask what was happening again, but Mrs. Cattell cut in. "Please, Florence, I need you to do this." Mrs. Cattell paused for a moment to lovingly caress the top of her daughter's head before getting back to business. "Quickly, go." Nodding, Florence hurried up the stairs as fast as she could without waking Millie. Mrs. Cattell had always been kind to her, but she'd never begged Florence for anything before. Something was very wrong. Florence could hear the other 3 children in their rooms across the hall packing bags when their mother came in. Mrs. Cattell berated them for packing toys and tablets, insisting they leave them. Only the essentials were coming with them. After finishing packing Millie's bag, Florence headed to her room when she was intercepted by the youngest Cattell boy, Hector. "Miss Flo," he said through teary eyes, "are they going to get us?" "Of course not, Hector. No one is going to get us," she answered by rote. Florence wasn't even sure why they were in such a rush to leave. Surely it couldn't have gotten that bad. Then, as an afterthought, she added, "Remember, Hector, we have the best soldier in the Cognac army protecting us. Why do you think your dad got your brother stationed here with us?" "Hector," Sergeant Cattell said from behind Florence. She jumped at the unexpected voice. At that, the smile that had been starting to flow on her small boy's face vanished. Sergeant Cattell continued unhampered. "Finish grabbing your stuff and meet my soldiers by the back door." Hector ran, nodding dutifully, ran up, hugged his brother's legs, then ran off to grab his things. Turning towards her, Sergeant Cattell asked Florence a question. Every human gets basic combat and survival training before they're allowed to work on non-human planets, right? Florence nodded wordlessly. Millie still fast asleep in one of her arms. With a face as serious as an avalanche, Sergeant Cattell reached behind himself and pulled out a pistol and handed it to Florence. Take this. You might need it. Atto, I can't take a gun, she whispered, wide-eyed and gesturing to the sleeping infant in her arms. Flo, this isn't negotiable, he said, his face somehow growing even harder. I'm getting my family out of here, whatever it takes. Momorelli has one, so does Yoto and Yocto. Yoto and Yocto, Florence cut in. Atto, you can't. They're not even teenagers yet. They're not old enough to... They're old enough to defend themselves from the people trying to kill them. Now, take the gun. Florence grabbed the gun, slowly and clumsily flipping it both sides before sliding it down the small of her back into a sash on her dress around her waist. Sergeant Cattell turned and walked down the stairs. Florence followed, her heart in her throat and her stomach in knots. The safety was already off. At the back door, one of Atto's soldiers was peering through the small eyepiece. Yoto and Yocto stood nearby with their backpacks on, fiddling with guns Atto had given them. They were so preoccupied with how cool the guns were, they didn't stop to consider why they had them in the first place. Mrs. Cattell was holding Hector by the hand. She looked a hair's breadth from panic, only managing to summon the strength to keep it together for the sake of her kids. Abruptly, shots rang out from the front of the house, and everyone instinctively ducked. Florence looked to make sure Millie was all right, and realized that she was already covering both rows of ears without realizing it. Another of Sergeant Cattell's soldiers came running from the front of the house, where the shots had come from, blood streaming down her face. Sorry, sir, I couldn't talk them down at the gate. She reached up to her hairline, and her hand came back bloody. Looking from her hand to the commanding officer, she answered the unasked question. One of them clipped me with a brick. It's nasty out there, sir. Florence watched Atto look over his family. Hector was clutching their mother's skirt, crying. Yoto and Yocto's looks of fascination had been replaced with ones of fear and uncertainty. The hair's breadth that Mrs. Cattell had been from panic had somehow managed to get even smaller. Florence couldn't even imagine what her own face looked like. She thought. Unconsciously, she caressed Millie's head in her arms. It's time to get out of here, Sergeant Cattell said. We're doing a 3-point formation with me taking lead. Mom, Flo, keep the kids in the middle. Yocto, open the door on my count, then get behind Flo. Florence nodded and started gathering the children to stand between the soldiers. Absent-mindedly, she pulled a wool hat out of her bag and put it on Millie's head. It wasn't freezing outside, but it was still cold. Sergeant Cattell stood facing the soldier who'd been looking through the eyepiece. Both their rifles were pointed to the ground. Atto did a quick check, making sure everyone was ready, then nodded to Yocto. Yocto flung the door open, and Atto and the other soldier darted through the opening, crossing each other. They opened fire almost immediately. Everyone ducked again. Let's go, Atto shouted back into the house. At nearly the same time, the front door crashed open, and the bloodied soldier behind Florence spun and opened fire at the intruders. Mrs. Cattell and the children were frozen in place, except Millie, who finally woke up, screaming. Trying to calm the infant, Florence pushed everyone forward with her free hand, out into the cold, dark night. Barely visible, Gnorneyans were flooding into the backyard from either side of the house. The bright muzzle flashes blotted out parts of Florence's vision. Between the shouting mob, gunfire, and crying baby, she could hardly hear anything. Darting forward, the members of the ambassador's household. She ran over the lawn towards the forest at the back of the property. The soldier with the bloody gash on her head stumbled backwards over her own feet, onto the down. In a flash, she was up on one knee, but still a little unsteady. The mob of Ghanaians were on her before she managed to fire off more than a half-dozen shots. Her screams pierced through the rest, the sound filling Florence's ears. Hearing his team members' cries, the other soldier with Sergeant Cattell stopped retreating and started advancing on the mob, firing wildly at the thickest part of the mob where his friend had been swallowed whole. Running through the entire clip before he reached the Ghanaians, he started using his rifle as a club. He attacked them in that way only someone trained in combat can do against untrained opponents. To Florence's horror, one of the Ghanaians went the long way around, getting past his defenses, and ran him through with gardening shears. At the tree line, Sergeant Cattell slowed. As Mrs. Cattell ran past him, he quickly squeezed her free hand, pulling her to a stop. He said something to her that Florence couldn't hear over the clamor. Mrs. Cattell's hair's breadth was gone. She started crying. Sergeant Cattell turning back towards the oncoming mob, opening fire, dropping one Ghanaian for every shot he took. "Keep running!" he shouted over his shoulder. "Yocto, protect Hector and Mom. Shoot anyone that follows you." His family just stood there, listening to what their brother, their son, had just said and realizing what it meant. Noticing his family had slowed, he shouted angrily, "Run! Flo, get them out of here!" Florence was about to shout when she was shoved hard from behind. Tumbling down, she spun to protect Millie, taking the brunt of the impact with the ground on her back. She rolled a few times on the ground, losing grip of Millie in the process. She was hurt, badly, but her mind threw that to the side. She needed to find Millie. Scrambling up, she looked back to where she had been pushed. A Ghanaian was walking up to where Millie lay crying on the ground, lifting his shovel above his head. Florence, on all fours, grabbed whatever was beneath her hands and threw it with both hands at the Ghanaian. She didn't wait to see how hard she'd hit him, desperately looking for. Her eyes fell on a large rock, too large for her to normally lift. She grabbed in one hand and swung the rock with the weight of her entire body. The Ghanaian's skull caved in at that same time as her shoulder tore. She dropped to her knees, clutching her shoulder in pain. A cry cut through her pain, and she turned to see Millie safely lying on the ground behind her, as though someone had softly placed her on the forest floor. Florence picked up the infant with a good arm. She turned to see the rest of the Cattell family in disarray. Somehow, the few Ghanaians had made it into the forest around Atta and attacked them. Yotta was leaning over Yocto, who was lying motionless on the ground. The not-yet teenager grasped the pistol with white knuckles, hands still shaking. She shot an approaching Ghanaian that Florence hadn't noticed before taking aim at another and firing again. Bile filled Florence's mouth upon seeing this once sweet girl kill two people without hesitation. Tears started to form before Florence noticed Hector trying to hug his mother on the ground and his mother trying to push him away. Neither of them saw the Ghanaian approaching from behind. Panic filled Florence as another shot rang out from Yotto's pistol at a Ghanaian in the opposite direction. With a flash of realization, Florence transferred Millie to her bad arm. She thought she heard more tearing from the weight, but pushed it to the back of her mind. She didn't have time. Pulling the gun out from her sash, she aimed at the Ghanaian and pulled the trigger, waiting only long enough to be sure that she killed him. She spun around, seeing 3 more Ghanaians approaching. She killed each one in turn. Shuffling over to Yotta, she tried to pull her off her dead brother, but Yotta jerked away. Florence only then noticed the bone sticking out of Yotta's leg. She wasn't going anywhere. Fighting back tears, she went over to Hector and Mrs. Cattell, who was still trying to push her small son away. Leaning down, Florence put the gun back in her sash and picked up Hector. "Young man," she said, trying desperately to stop her voice from breaking, "your mother told you to go. That's exactly what you're going to do." Hector went to complain, but Florence shut it down before he started. "Say bye to your mother," she said, struggling. We'll see her when we get back." As Hector said bye and climbed up on Florence's back, Mrs. Cattell mouthed the thanks to Florence, eyes full of tears and chest covered in blood. Florence turned towards the forest, Millie in one arm and Hector being held in a piggyback with her other. She could hear the Ghanaians overtaking Atta behind her. Thinking about her survival training, she started to run. When all else is lost, run. Nothing can run as fast as a human. She had to keep Hector and Millie safe, whatever it took. End of part 1. I would just like to thank the T5 supporters: Bushmaster 117, Casper Arnholtz, Draxoon WRE, Elijah Silvercross, Gray, John Carrington, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.